Hello, my name is Carol Gravel, and welcome to my vlog on in-depth interviews. First, an overview of what my presentation will include. I'll start off by explaining what in-depth interviews are. Next, I'll outline some of the opportunities and challenges with in-depth interviews. And finally, I'll discuss 3 research studies which used in-depth interviews as part of their methodologies. So, let's get started. According to Cresswell, 2014, in-depth interviews are a qualitative approach to explore and understand the meaning individuals or groups ascribe to a social or human problem. These include face-to-face interviews with participants, telephone interviews, focus groups, and email communications. These interviews involve unstructured and generally open-ended questions that are few in number and intended to elicit views and opinions from participants. Cresswell 2014 also notes they are a good method of inquiry when the researcher wants to have control over the line of questioning. What are the opportunities of in-depth interviews? Well, according to Cresswell 2014, in-depth interviews provide indirect information filtered to the views of the interviewees. They also provide information in a designated place rather than a natural field setting. Some of the challenges suggested by Cresswell 2014 with in-depth interviews include the researcher's presence may bias responses, and not all people are as equally articulate and perceptive. And now to our first article. Owen 2008 looked to in-depth interviews and focus groups to understand the ambiguity that exists around the role of ethics counsel in public relations. As part of this research study, Bowen 2008 asked, how robust is the understanding of ethical decision-making among public relations professionals? Bowen grounded her research using systems theory and James Grunig's excellence theory. Systems theory is one that relies on the interconnectedness of elements within an environment, and it's a good one to examine the role of public relations practitioners as ethics counselors because they are the ones who interact with the public. Moreover, this study lends strength to PR professionals for acting in the ethics counselor role because, says Bowden, that other organizational functions who might advise on ethical matters are likely to have very limited contact with external publics, such as the legal department. The excellence theory is one you are likely pretty familiar with, it being, of course, the theory that suggests the public relations function has a strong role to play in maintaining linkages with strategic publics in the organization's environment. As part of the research, Bowen 2008 came up with 2 broad questions, and they are, do public relations professionals believe they should act as the ethical conscience of the organization? And to what extent, if any, do public relations professionals counsel the dominant coalition, or CEO, in matters of ethics? In terms of the methodology used, the study was sponsored by the International Association of Business Communicators, IABC, Research Foundation. IABC members from the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Israel chapters were recruited via their membership email addresses in a snowball fashion for focus groups and in-depth interviews. 4 focus groups and 12 individual interviews were conducted by 4 professionally trained interviewers and moderators. Assistance and transcription were provided by graduate students compensated by grant funds. Researchers sought out executive-level public relations professionals and conducted semi-structured interviews with them. Prior to the majority of the interviews occurring, interview guides were used. This meant that the guides were refined through a pre-test with 3 interviewees prior to the interviews with the executives. All interviews were audio recorded with permission and informed consent of the participants. Other interview best practices that were followed included sending the interview guide to the participants prior to the interview. This allowed participants time to preview the questions in advance, to feel more comfortable with the topics that would be discussed, and overall be in a better position to answer questions with supporting examples in the interview. The 4 focus groups were segmented according to experience levels. All participants volunteered to attend, signed informed consent forms, and were paid a modest stipend. A bank donated the use of a room for the focus groups. Each focus group lasted about 2 hours and hosted about 8 to 12 participants. To analyze the data, Miles and Huberman's 1994 technique was used to reduce the data along the guidelines of a thematic analysis. 2 central themes and many subtitles emerged. Checks of the data were completed by asking participants to read narratives by their focus groups or the transcript of their own interview and to comment on it for meaning, accuracy, and clarity, according to Bowen 2008. The results of the research indicated 2 clear streams based on the research questions, with thematic perspectives substantiated by the data collected. The findings were easy to read and focused. Some limitations of the data that were collected included that it was collected in 4 Western and industrialized countries, possibly representing a cultural bias, according to Bowen 2008. She also mentioned that all interviews took place in the United States and all participants were from the chemical petroleum industries. Reflexivity is when an inquirer reflects about how his/her role in the study and how their personal background, culture, and experiences may hold the potential for shaping the themes advanced, according to Creswell 2014. Bowen referred to reflexivity when she identified her own bias as an American who had been socialized with Western views. She suggested in this article that this bias could potentially take the form of a preference toward individualist ideas or autonomy over collectivism as it related to the data collection. Bowen 2008 suggests extensions for further research include 1. More quantitative research be undertaken to explore the extent to which age is correlated with the ethics counselor role in public relations, and 2. Further research be conducted to explore the aspects of being the ethics counselor. The implication of this research? If public relations professionals are to take the reins of strategic management responsibility, knowledge of ethical deliberation and active ethical counsel is required. Bowen 2008. My second article was another ethically themed study. McNamara 2010 turned to a mixed methods research design using a survey and in-depth interviews to examine how public relations practitioners utilize social media and how they were being deployed. Like Bowen 2008, this research also used the theoretical framework of James Grunig's excellence theory, which places emphasis on the interactive practices that involve two-way symmetrical communication, as well as cited literature on interactivity and social media theory. McNamara's 2010 research investigated 2 broad questions. 1. How social media are perceived and used in their organization, and 2. How social media are seen to be influencing or changing public relations practice if, in fact, they are. This study was conducted in 2 stages. First, a survey questionnaire was deployed with close-ended questions and a series of open-ended questions. This quantitative approach helped the researchers to collect basic data from practitioners about the social media they used and the time spent on it, in addition to their perceptions, concerns, and viewpoints. The survey was followed by in-depth interviews with a number of practitioners to further explore their practices, understandings, perceptions, and future intentions about social media. Though there was no mention of ethical considerations in this article, such as whether the participants gave permission via informed consent forms, the working assumption I'm working with is that ethics clearance for the research was obtained. I presume journal editors have a responsibility to check for this prior to publishing any research studies anyway. From my viewpoint, I think ethics clearance should be as explicit as it was in the study by Bowen, 2008. For this research, a sample of 15 senior public relations practitioners was purposefully selected. Now, McNamara does not specify what senior means in this context. I presume it means a reflection of years of experience, though he is not specific in what he means by senior. The practitioners were selected based on their position titles, which were considered by the researchers to be best able to represent the views and practices of the agency or organization overall. Names and titles were obtained using a number of lists, including the Registered Consultants Group of the Public Relations Institute of Australia, 2010, the Directory of Australian Associations, Crown Content 2010, and the contact sections of websites. In terms of limitations, McNamara 2010 states, while the sample was adequate for qualitative exploration of the research questions, quantitative data collected is non-generalizable. Essentially, he's saying that the results derived from the quantitative sampling procedure are not good enough to generalize what's going on in the population, yet the results from the in-depth interviews are. I think he's confusing 2 different things here, sample size and sample selection. According to Cresswell 2014, he recommends a random sampling approach to quantitative research, meaning that each individual in the population has an equal probability of being selected. Only a representative sample allows the ability to generalize from the sample to the population. I would suggest McNamara provide more information about this survey instrument. How many surveys were distributed? What was the response rate? I would think the study should report this as a reflection of the response rate. Plus, I believe there may be an industry definition for reporting survey response rates. I also beg to differ with McNamara on the sample for the qualitative research being adequate, given it is reflective of only 5 public relations practitioners. Given the number of participants, it's tough to say whether the researchers reached a level of saturation. According to Cresswell, 2014, there should be double the number of participants in these in-depth interviews to reach saturation. Further, he cites that sufficient data is not available to identify the differences between sectors such as business, not-for-profit, or particular industries. I'm referring, of course, to McNamara 2010. It might be interesting to identify why practitioners declined to participate after they agreed to, of course, for the in-depth interviews. Another limitation, researchers should carefully consider how their personal backgrounds, culture, and experiences might play a role in the research and highlight this within the study. There is no discussion of how the data was analyzed, and/or interpreted in this study. Quite a different approach than what Bowen 2008 had taken. Essentially, this means that the reader does not know how the data was analyzed. It could have been completed in an unsystematic or arbitrary way. I would suggest that applying a set of rules for data analysis in a systematic way on a case-by-case basis is required in this research and would add validity and clarity to the findings. The findings in this study were much different than those found in Bowen 2008. They weren't organized thematically. Instead, the findings were arranged in several paragraphs, highlighting some of the key inputs from participants. McNamara 2010 concludes that the findings are inconsistent with other research conducted in the United States, United Kingdom, Europe, and Asia over the past few years. There are a number of reasons why Australian findings are not consistent with other parts of the world, including the research design could be flawed, but we have no way of knowing why this is. Further research is recommended by McNamara 2010 into levels of interactivity, the issue of control, practitioner knowledge and skills, and ethics in social media use, which are shown to be topical issues, but far from clear or resolved. And now the third and final study. This will be the study in the discussion forum this week. In 2014, McNamara looked to in-depth interviews to examine the interrelationship between journalism and public relations from a qualitative perspective. He came up with 5 research questions to conduct his research. How do senior journalists and PR practitioners view each other and their respective roles? How do journalists and PR practitioners negotiate widely identified tensions and interact as research shows they do? Do journalists and PR practitioners maintain integrity and ethics in dealing with each other, and, if so, how? What, if anything, should be done in journalism and PR education and training to address issues and concerns raised in empirical studies and this research? And what other mechanisms, if any, should be put in place to ensure independence of media content while maintaining freedom of speech and freedom of the media? Unlike the other 2 studies that I talked about before, this research did not put forth a theory or theoretical lens. According to Cresswell 2014, a theoretical lens or perspective helps to explain the components of the study. For example, data collection, analysis, and interpretation. The methodology of the study focused on a qualitative approach. Interviews were conducted face-to-face, involved multiple discussions, particularly e-interviews that took place over the telephone, Skype, Microsoft Link, and via multiple email exchanges. All of the face-to-face interviews were recorded and transcribed, except one that was conducted in a noisy place, says McNamara 2014. In this case, it is clear the researchers did not want geographic location to hinder their data collection, so they used an interface, for example, the telephone or the computer, to communicate directly with participants. But it raises some questions. How much time was allotted to speak to the participants? Was the same amount of time given to all participants? And was the participant distracted perhaps by other activities during the interview, such as not devoting one-on-one time to the researchers, such as they may be answering other emails or attending to other things? The study included some discussion on how the sample was chosen for the research. Initially, research began with a pilot study among a purposive sample of information technology and telecommunications journalists and public relations practitioners. Cresswell 2014 suggests that a purposive sample helps the researcher to better understand the problem and the research question. To gain more broad-based insights, 23 interviews were conducted in 2013 with senior editors, journalists, and public relations practitioners with 20 years of experience or more across multiple industries within the United Kingdom, United States, and Australia. I like how McNamara defines senior as being 20 years of experience plus or more, as opposed to how he did not define it in his previous study in 2010. 3 of those interviews, McNamara cited to have been journalists in the Solomon Islands and a senior public relations practitioner in the Pacific. Collecting insights from participants who are internationally located, as well as in countries not necessarily within westernized countries, provides researchers with a greater richness of context than what might have been collected before. The sampling frame described that interviewees were drawn from general news and a range of industry and specialist sectors. To address ethical considerations, participants were offered anonymity for both their name and their organization's name. And as I said previously, I think ethics clearance should be as explicit as it was for the study by Bowen. Good work by McNamara here. To analyze the data, transcripts from the interviews and texts such as follow-up emails were analyzed using qualitative textual content analysis techniques based on coding from Shoemaker and Reese from 1996. Manual coding of interview transcripts and texts was undertaken at 2 levels. Software was used to analyze the transcripts into 16 broad categories established prior to data collection. I believe this to be a deductive rather than inductive approach to creating categories from the data. A second level of axial coding was then undertaken inductively to identify the specific views, perceptions, practices, concerns, proposals, and recommendations that emerged within these categories to reveal patterns and clusters of views. Limitations outlined in this study include that the sample contained a gender skew to men in both journalism and PR. Slightly less than 1/3 of participants were women, according to McNamara 2014. And this is interesting because the current gender imbalance of the professions which favor women. McNamara 2014 tried to explain this by citing practitioners with 25 to 35 years of experience are more likely to be men, as this reflects the recruitment patterns of the 1970s and 80s. Another limitation cited by McNamara 2014 was that while the study set out to capture a balanced mix of views, researchers encountered a greater reluctance by journalists to be interviewed, as opposed to PR practitioners. I question why this happened had the ethical considerations been explicit in their methodology. The findings section was clearly thematic and substantiated by the research. For me, it was clear and easy to read, as opposed to his 2010 study that we talked about earlier. McNamara concluded that more than ever, PR needs to focus on ethics and consider societal interests. He argues that there is an urgent need for education of journalists about PR, for commitment to training and professional development of young PR practitioners, as well as a review of codes of ethics and codes of practice to keep pace with emergent media practices and formats. McNamara 2014. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to furthering this discussion about in-depth interviews in the discussion forum this week. Thank you.